Today we take a look at the M1A1 Abrams versus the T-72 M1 in Iraqi service. I quite often get comments from people stating that they already knew before the Ukraine war that the T-72 was bad, because they were decimated in Iraq in 1991 during Operation Desert Storm. My main issue with this point is that, well, first off, these T-72s were export models. Second, I doubt that the Iraqi training was on par with the Soviet training. And third, these T-72's export models were first tier in the Iraqi army, whereas in the Soviet army they were second tier behind the T-80s. Now in this video we look mostly at the technical and tactical factors, but also touch the bigger picture, since the technical specifications alone can be misleading. First off, let's clarify which specific models we will look at in this video. The M1 Abrams was originally used with a 105mm gun, but soon a newer variant was produced, the M1A1 with the 120mm gun. There was also the M1A1 HA, whereas HA stands for heavy armor. In total, the US Army deployed about 1,966 M1A1 variants during Operation Desert Storm, 733 regular M1A1s, and 1,233 M1A1s HAs. So the majority had the armor upgrade. As such, the M1A1 HA will serve as a baseline in this video. Iraq had purchased a total of 1,038 T-72s according to Stephen Zaloga. The most modern version of these were the T-72 M1s, which will serve as the baseline in this video to compare the best tank of each side. The T-72 M1 is roughly equivalent to the T-72A in the Soviet arsenal, which already entered service in the Soviet army in 1979. So by 1991, the T-72 M1 was already a bit dated. For comparison, the Soviet Union in 1985 added Contact 1 explosive reactive armor to the C-72As, upgrading them to the T-72AV, and introduced the new T-72B. Ryan Ten, the author of the new book T-72, The Definite Guide of the Soviet Workhorse, will give you now a brief overview how the T-72 M1 compared to the T-72B.
The T-72B, which entered service in 1985, was significantly better armored than the T-72 M1, and it also had a slightly improved FCS. It had a lead calculator, which meant that the gunner could lace the target and determine how much he needed to lead the target according to a milliradian scale. So the sight would display the milliradians that the gunner would need to apply manually in his sight to lead a moving target. The armor, of course, was improved on its basic thickness and also by the additional armor. So the basic T-72B had Contact 1 reactive armor, even since its beginning in 1985. And since 1988, it had Contact 5 reactive armor. Contact 5 was so-called heavy reactive armor, which meant that it could stop not just shape-charged warheads, but also kinetic energy ones like APFSDS. According to some reports, the M829A1 APFSDS round could not penetrate a T-72B with Contact 5 reactive armor, although based on some data, it's quite evident that this only applies to the most heavily armored parts of the tank and not the entire profile of the tank. Nevertheless, the T-72B was overall much better armored, and it had somewhat better chances against moving targets compared to the T-72 M1.
Now let's compare the M1A1 HA and the T-72 M1. First off, firepower. The M1A1 used the 120mm M256, which is a derivative of the Rheinmetall gun that is also used in the Leopard 2. Whereas the T-72 was equipped with the 125mm D81TM. Yet the caliber and gun type in this case is of lesser importance. Far more important is actually the supplied ammo. The Iraqis should have been manufacturing the 3VBM7 armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot, short APFSDS round, since the late 1980s. Yet according to Zaloga, US troops often found the 3VBM3 rounds. These could penetrate about 290mm of rolled homogeneous armor at 2000 meter range at a 0-degree angle. The 3V BM7 meanwhile could penetrate about 400 mm. In comparison, the latest Soviet round, the 3V BM13, which has a depleted uranium penetrator, could penetrate up to 550 or 560 mm, depending on the source. Since it was a monoblock penetrator, it performs far better against composite armor that is generally used in modern tanks like the Abrams or Leopard 2. According to Zaloga, the frontal protection of the M1A1 HA against APFSDS was 600 mm on the hull and 800 mm on the turret. Other sources suggest that the armor on the turret ranged from 400 to 800 mm, depending on the location. This meant that the best armor that was available to the Iraqis generally could be barely able to penetrate frontally if they hit a weaker part of the turret. Keep in mind that the armor and penetration values are generally to be taken with a grain of salt, since some are estimates and even testing might bring different results at time. Now the M1A1s were generally equipped with the M829 APFSDS rounds. These did not have a tungsten carbide penetrator but a depleted uranium rod. It is estimated that it can penetrate 520 or 540 mm at 2000 meters range at a 0-degree angle, so similar to the Soviet depleted uranium round at the time. Now the frontal protection of the T-72 M1 against APFSDS was about 400 mm, and the turret had 380 according to some sources, where others note that it had around 400 to 450 mm. So even if we take the highest value, the M829 would have no problem penetrating the armor of the T-72 M1 frontally. Additionally, US troops also had the M822A1 rounds in limited numbers that offered even higher penetration. Yet some troops reported that generally these rounds were not needed. Another aspect of firepower is of course the fire control system, since to penetrate something, you must first hit it. Ryan 10 will give you now a brief overview about the T-72 M1 system.
In the T-72 fire control system, what the gunner does is he puts his sight on the target and he lasers it using the red projected reticle for the laser rangefinder. This then lowers the reticle to show the gunner the required super elevation to raise the reticle onto the target. With his power control handles, the gunner could raise the gun until the reticle was on the target and then open fire. This was a fairly moderate degree of automation compared to modern fire control systems, but it was definitely a step above the World War II style of fire control systems, which can still be found in tanks like the T-62 and T-55. Of course, the limitations of the system are that there were no lead calculations or any compensations for wind. So gunners had to do what's called Kentucky windage, just estimate. Of course, with the extremely high velocity of the 125 millimeter APFSDS rounds, this wasn't a huge problem, at least not under 2 kilometers.
Zaloga notes, with limited training, Iraqi T-72 crews would often battle-sight the gun to a predetermined range, usually 1,800 meters, and leave these settings in place. Meanwhile, the fire control system of the M1A1 was mostly automated to minimize data inputs from the gunner. The digital ballistic computer required a low amount of training and attention. In short, while the Iraqi T-72s could only frontally penetrate the Abrams with the best supplied ammo under ideal circumstances at a range of 2 kilometers frontally, meanwhile the Abrams could penetrate the strongest part of the T-72 M1's armor at that range without problems. Additionally, the chances of scoring a hit were overall far better for the M1 due to better fire control systems and training. Next is armor protection. We already discussed the armor values briefly. As such, we look at related factors that offer protection. First off is size. The T-72 here clearly has the edge. It is smaller and thus harder to hit. Particularly its turret is far smaller than that of the M1A1 Abrams. The projected frontal area of the T-72A sandbar turret was 1.48 square meters, comparing very favorable to the 2.5 square meters of the frontal area presented by the M60A1 turret, the 2.4 square meters of the M1A1 Abrams turret, and even the Leopard 1's much lower turret with 2 square meters of frontal area. The low projected area of the turret was maintained across a wide frontal arc due to its teardrop shape. This is related to the next factor, namely digging in. Ideally, the Iraqi T-72s would dig themselves in to get a lower profile and protect the hull.
A T-72 can dig itself in with its own integrated dozer blade. According to Soviet norms, on medium soil, it will take up to 20 minutes. On sandy soil, it will take 15 minutes. Of course, in the deserts of Iraq, the actual time needed to dig in a T-72 would probably be shorter. First, the driver dismounts and unlatches the dozer blade and then gets back in. The commander gets out of the tank and supervises the driver from outside to make sure that the fighting position is dug properly, and he inspects it from outside to get an idea of how the enemy would see it. Ideally, the fighting position should be well camouflaged, and at least it should not appear to protrude from the ground. On flat terrain, this was still a problem because there were no local objects for the tank to blend into, but it was still better than standing out in the open. Of course, in European terrain, this was a much more effective way of fortifying a defensive line.
As such, only a small turret profile of the T-72 would be visible. Now, if you want to learn more about the T-72, be sure to get Ryan's book, The T-72, The Definitive Guide to the Soviet Workhorse, and enjoy a 20% discount from 13th until 27th September 2024, and about 10% on all our other books. The book has about 480 pages, it uses an extensive number of Soviet sources and details various aspects of the Soviet T-72 and its variants, ranging from ergonomics to armor, particularly how it was continuously upgraded. Professor Hazel states, "Whether you are a military enthusiast, a history buff, or simply curious about the machines that shape our world, this book offers a comprehensive exploration of one of the most iconic tanks of the modern era." Check it out in the description. Now let's look at mobility next. The M1A1 had a far more powerful engine with 1500 horsepower, while the T-72 M1 only had 80 horsepower. Yet the difference in horsepower per ton was not that big. The M1A1 had 23 horsepower per ton, whereas the T-72 had 19.8 horsepower per ton. This was possible since the T-72 was a very compact tank for its firepower and armor protection. In terms of max speed, the M1A1 was a bit faster. Another major difference was that the M1A1 used a gas turbine. These were very thirsty and consume a lot of fuel when idle. Technically, both had about the same range on the road, but in practice, the T-72, particularly with external fuel tanks, could outrange the M1A1. Yet in overall, this did not matter very much, since the Iraqi forces were not moving around. The US forces took the initiative early on and the Iraqi units barely maneuvered. Before we look at the bigger picture, we also need to account for some additional factors, namely training and maintenance. The Iraqi army was far less trained than US troops. The Iraqi army by 1990 had undergone an enormous expansion and ballooned up to the fourth largest army in the world. This usually comes at a price, particularly in a regime that enforced loyalty by secret police and officer purchase. It lacked a proper NCO corps, meanwhile command and control was rather restrictive as well. Now the T-72s were mostly used in the Republican Guard units. Yet Zaloga notes, "It is unclear whether training was markedly better than in the rest of the army. But the Republican Guard Forces Command troops were certainly far better motivated than the rest of the army, as would become very evident in the 1991 Gulf War." Additionally, he notes that in previous conflicts, the Iraqi used armor mostly in a support role and in defensive combat, not in a tank versus tank combat. As such, in terms of tactics, even experienced commanders were not ready for the US forces. The lack of training directly leads to the next aspect, namely maintenance or the lack thereof. Zaloga notes the tank guns saw extensive use in support roles that likely had worn out the barrels. He notes that US troops reported that Iraqi troops often missed their shots. This problem likely was not limited to barrels, as such the overall performance of the T-72 in Iraqi service was generally lower than the values indicate. Now keep in mind that these values, although interesting, might have a limited influence on the outcome of a battle, let alone a campaign. What do I mean by that? Well, on paper, the T-34 was superior to the best German tanks like the Panzer III in 1941. in regards to firepower, armor, and mobility, yet at the same time the Germans were able to almost reach Moscow. As such, the technical factors are not necessarily the determining factors. To summarize, the Iraqi army's best tank was the T-72 M1, an export model of the T-72 that was about equivalent to the one the Soviet army introduced in 1979. It was also equipped with a rather dated ammunition. Meanwhile, the M1A1 used depleted uranium ammunition that was up to newer standards. The M1A1 was a newer tank, and the domestic model it outmatched the T-72 M1 in nearly every aspect besides fuel economy. Although considering the logistical power of the US forces, that probably would not have mattered at all as well. While the numbers clearly show an advantage for the US tank, other factors like crew training, maintenance morale, and other factors skewed the picture even more into the favor of the US forces. In other words, if you base your opinion of the T-72 on the experience from Desert Storm, you might be drawing conclusions from a very problematic dataset. Thanks to Ryan 10 for the interview and providing additional information. Thank you to Andrew for reviewing the script. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.